And look at verse 4. After Hagar conceives, it says her mistress was despised in her sight. Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my wife into your arms when she saw that she had conceived. I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarai treated her harshly. She fled from her presence. Verse 4, Hagar conceived, and her mistress was despised in her sight. The word despised means to treat lightly or to look down upon somebody as being insignificant. You're looking down upon somebody. Like, remember Timothy Paul said to Timothy, don't let anyone look down upon your youth, despise your youth. And this is what Hagar's doing. Hagar's Sarah's maid, Sarai's maid. So she's not her equal in society, not in social standing. She's not her equal. The world back then didn't see it that way at all. But she feels a little emboldened now. And so she has this condescending attitude. She's successful now. She's pregnant. Sarai's not pregnant. Sarai's not successful. She's a failure at this point. She doesn't have any children. The lowly Egyptian maid now has one up on her mistress. Her mistress is superior to her, but now Hagar feels a little bit superior to her superior, Sarai, at least in this respect. Of course, that's a wrong spirit to have. We shouldn't have that. Hagar sins, by the way, with this attitude. Have you noticed that all three of these characters, Hagar, Abram, and Sarai, they all sin in this episode? No one's clear of guilt here, not any of them. But we never want to provoke others, never want to do that. If we have something somebody else doesn't have, if we have status, if we have wealth, if we have children, or whatever it may be, we never want to lord it over someone else. Look what I have, and you don't. That's pride. We never want to demonstrate that proud attitude or rejoice in someone's misfortune. We don't want to have a revengeful spirit. That's never the way of God's people, but Hagar immediately, boy, she's going to have this condescending attitude all of a sudden. The lowly maid, the lowly servant. As a result, Sarai's, what's going to happen? She's going to get very jealous. And jealousy breeds anger and hatred and discord and actions that are anything but Christ-like. So Sarai takes her jealousy out. You know, when someone's in a rage of jealousy, they're not going to act in a rational manner. They're going to do a bunch of crazy stuff and blame everybody and their brother. She doesn't just blame Hagar. She blames both Abram and Hagar. She's mad at both Abram and Hagar. First Abram, look at verse 5. Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done me be upon you. When I did this, now she's Hagar's despising me. In other words, in Hagar's view, her husband is at fault here. He's to blame for all this. It's his fault. He's wronged her. That word translated wrong is a very interesting word, very strong term. It can mean, we've used this word back in Genesis chapter 6. It can be any kind of anti-social, unneighborly activity. I must have said something crazy. Everybody's smiling. Sometimes you say things, Mike, and you say, what did I just say? You know? Okay, yeah. Okay, if somebody scratch that, the recorder can scratch that from the sermon. Yeah, whoever it was, I have no idea. This lady says, whoever she is, says she was wronged. Sarai was wronged by Abram. That is any kind of antisocial, unneighborly activity. Anything that's like that, it's a wide definition. It's a violation of people's rights. You violated my rights, my husband. It can even be translated as involving physical harm. It can be translated as violence. You know, in Genesis 6, it's translated as violence. More than one. That was an accurate description of the world before the flood. Sarai is really blasting Abraham for what happened. She is on his case. Her plan is totally backfired. She's totally now jealous and irrational, and so she blames her husband. Notice who she doesn't blame. She doesn't blame herself. Yet it's her plan. Yet Abraham is at fault. Yeah, Abraham is at fault. Yes, it's true. But Sarai is also. And notice she even appeals to the Lord to defend her innocence. May the Lord judge between me and you. How ironic. We do that, don't we? We sin, and somehow we think the Lord should excuse our sin, for our sin. Well, you know, it really wasn't my fault, Lord. It was actually my husband's fault. Actually, it was my wife's fault. I had really nothing to do with it. When we think through logically, I had nothing to do with this at all. And that can happen in marital relationships. And we want to appeal to the Lord. Hey, you know, Lord, get this straightened out here. Referee this for me because I didn't really do anything wrong at all. It can happen to any relatives who are clashing over different matters. It can happen between roommates, co-workers. Guess what that reminds me of? Genesis chapter 3, where the woman says, well, the serpent deceived me. It's his fault. And the man says, the woman you gave to be with me, it's kind of your fault and her fault. The truth is, I should own up to my own sin and not blame other people, not excuse myself. And so she's mad at Abram. Next, she expresses her anger at Hagar. Abram in verse 6 once again demonstrates a passive attitude. He says, well, Sarai, just do whatever you think you should do. I'm kind of like out of the loop right now. Not doing my job as a husband right now, so do whatever you want. Sarai is all too happy to take on that job. Verse 6, so Sarai treated Hagar harshly. That word has to do with humiliating someone, to afflict a person. That same term is used in Genesis to describe when the humiliating misery the Israelites will face in Egypt. Same term, going to be humiliated. Sarai is really mean to Hagar, even though she was the one who in verse 3, gave Hagar to Abram to be his wife. She's the one that's behind all this stuff. Hagar makes a decision to run for it. She leaves the premises immediately. She gets out of there. Sarai has now shown her who is boss. I'm the boss, and I'll tell you what to do. The stupid choices we make in life, the sinful choices, the purely human plans we make apart from divine guidance can really foul up everything. Have you ever done that in your life? You fouled the whole thing up because of some dumb choice. We're not satisfied with our place in life. We're not satisfied where we are. We're not satisfied with our circumstances. There's something, I've had the same thing happen to me. There's something we must have, so we go after our own way. We want to mate. We're single and we want to mate, and we've failed to attain one so far, so we circumvent the providence of God. We try to do that somehow and date someone who is unsaved. I know all these things fall within the providence of God ultimately, although I don't understand it, but we figure, hey, we can't find someone who's saved around here. Let's date someone who was unsaved. That girl in the office, that guy in the office, he seems to be a nice person. I don't know if they're saved or not. Then they start making excuses. Well, I think they have a religious background. You ever talk to people like this? I think they go to church, went to church when they were 10 years old. It is what it is. I got to find somebody, and so they make up all kinds of excuses. We want that promotion, and we get tired of waiting for it, so we trample over somebody else to get it. Or we want more income, so we do something a little shady. God's not giving us any more money, so we do something a little shady to obtain it. We're not content with how the Lord is working in our lives. I've been there. So we come up with our own plan, our own plot. Let me figure this one out. We try to assist the Lord. Maybe I can help God figure this thing out. Maybe I can help his plan here to go a little further. And so we're desperate. In our condition, we do whatever it takes to make it happen. And we end up doing what? Complicating everything. Complication is the word here. You could list that word over this chapter. We concoct schemes that seem to have been hatched in hell as we look back on them later on. And we mess up people in the process, mess up a lot of people. The right thing to do is submit yourself to the Lord and his plans and wait on him. Take actions, yes, that are biblically legitimate. Take those actions that God says you can take. Do that. But wait on the Lord for his timing. His will is whatever he's doing. It never ends good when you try to do an end around on the Lord. It never does. So there's this human solution she comes up with, what she considers to be temporarily at least, the problem of divine providence. Secondly, in the last part of the chapter, there is divine intervention for the problem of human folly. Divine intervention for the problem of human folly in verses 7 to 16. The human folly is what we just witnessed in the first 6 verses. Total folly, totally ridiculous. And we humans are guilty of this folly, and then we complicate everything. We create great problems for everybody. A lot of times in our church, I'll get the phone call, Michael or somebody, and hey, can you help us out with this problem? And you trace it down, and you realize 20 sins were committed along the way here, and we ended up with the problem somehow, That happens all the time. And so we have all these problems, and in the last several verses, the Lord begins to pick up the pieces. Although there are consequences to sin, that can't be erased. It's not going to be erased. But the actions taken by the Lord in verses 7 to 16 are in stark contrast to the actions taken by the three characters in the first section. Let's see how that plays out as we look into the encounter between, first of all, Hagar and the angel of the Lord in verses 7 to 14. Look at verse 7. Now the angel of the Lord found Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. Now we have a fourth character introduced into our story, into the Bible itself. This is the first reference to the angel of the Lord. Who is he? It's interesting. There's no official introduction to him. None at all, as the Bible often does, and well, as it does sometimes. No official introduction, no explanation of who he is. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, it seems, he comes. So who is he? Well, the best way to make that determination is to look at the clues presented in the passage. But, and by the way, the angel of the Lord is going to be mentioned, I think, 58 times in the Old Testament. The angel of God, 11 times. He's mentioned 4 times in this passage. And for the sake of time, verse 13 will inform us that, to get to the bottom of this, that the angel of the Lord is the Lord himself. And we're going to spend time later on in another message on the angel of the Lord. But in verse 13, he's called by the name Lord. He's called by the name God. So the angel of the Lord is the Lord himself in some kind of visible form. The typical interpretation of these verses like this in the Old Testament is that he is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. And as I said tonight, we're not going to go into this much tonight. We will at a later date when we come across him again. But what I want you to notice is the grace. The grace the angel of the Lord shows to Hagar, of all people. And this is in 4 ways. First of all, his grace is demonstrated in his appearance to her. In verse 7, he appears to her. In fact, very first appearance in the Old Testament of the angel of the Lord. You know what's interesting to me? This first appearance of the angel of the Lord, he appears to a woman, number 1, to an Egyptian, number 2, to a slave, number 3. That's who he appears to. He doesn't appear to Abram first. He appears to this lady, this maid. Notice that the angel of the Lord first finds Hagar. He finds her in verse 7, found her by the spring of water, it says. Of course, being the angel of the Lord, he would know exactly where she was. But the point is this, he's purposely seeking an encounter with Hagar, of all people. Just like it was no mistake, I couldn't help but think of the woman at the well in John 4. When I read this, just like it was no mistake for Jesus to encounter that woman at the well, not a mistake at all, so it's no mistake for the angel of the Lord to purposely find and seek out Hagar. It's a divine appointment. Now, she had been able also to find something herself. She found some water, spring of water in the wilderness. Remember, she had fled in haste from her mistress. There was no suitcases she packed. She had no supplies. This is an unexpected journey, and so she's fortunate to come across water. So there she sits, pregnant. That's great. But now without a husband. Now without a home. Now without any hope. She's out there in the wilderness by herself. This is the second desperate woman in our story. She's in the wilderness on a way to a place called Shur. Shur was a wilderness region in northwest Sinai, located between southwest Canaan and northwest border of Egypt. Let me get to the bottom line. What does that tell us? It looks as though Hagar is headed back home to her native Egypt. She's going back to Egypt, where she's from. That's what she's doing. She's on the run from Sarai. The most logical thing for her to do is, hey, I'm just going to go back home, back to Egypt. But along the way, the angel of the Lord found her. Now, isn't it just like the Lord to go after the one sheep who's separated from all the rest? Isn't that what he does? I don't know if Hagar belongs to God's sheep or not. I have no idea. But it's typical of the Lord to care for the downcast, isn't it? All through the Scripture you see this. The hymn asks the question, does Jesus care? Oh, yes, he cares. It answers. He cares. He knows. He knew Hagar's pain. He knows your pain tonight, whatever it may be. He knows where you are. He knows where to find you. And he's there for you in your desperate situation. A lot of people are discouraged maybe, but remember, the Lord is there for you. His grace is demonstrated in the appearance he made to Hagar. Secondly, his grace is demonstrated in the guidance, the guidance he gives her. Verses 8 and 9. He said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress, Sarai. Notice how he addresses her by name. Hagar, Sarai's maid. What a personal touch. Hagar's nobody. She's a maid. She's a lowly servant, a lowly slave. But to the angel of the Lord, she's a person in need. That's how he sees people. He doesn't see the king of England as being somebody more special than the lowly slave. He doesn't see it that way. He sees everybody, and he cares for people. He knows her by name. He even with courtesy asked her the question, where are you going? Where'd you come from? Where are you going? Well, he knows good and well where she came from, where she's going. He knows that. But he wants her to tell him. And she does tell him. Now, we might think his answer would be, she's had a rough time. She was run away. She was, she fled the presence of her mistress. We might think his answer would be, well, just continue down to Egypt. And hopefully you're going to find, familiar surroundings, a more welcoming attitude from the people there. Maybe they'll welcome you after your harsh treatment. Maybe it'll be better for you. He doesn't say any of that at all. What does he say? Verse 9. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority, submit yourself under her hands, literally, to her authority. The word submit, here's what's interesting. The word submit is from the same root word that verse 6 translates treated harshly. That word treated harshly is the same root word as submit here. There, she was humiliated in verse 6. Verse 6, Sarai treats Hagar harshly. In verse 9, the angel of the Lord used that same word. So he's saying, in effect, go back to your mistress and endure that harsh treatment. Submit to her authority. Humble yourself before her. We could understand it like this. Hagar, you've been humiliated by Sarai. Now I want you to humble yourself and go back to Sarai and be her maid. And that's going to take lots of humility. Think about that. Now, maybe we're shocked at that. This is the answer the Lord gave. Sometimes the Lord wants us to endure tough situations. Sometimes we're in situations we don't like. I've been in those situations, and maybe you'll be there for a while. We can't always run away from them much as we would like to. I would like to run away from certain situations. In some ways, it might be easier to get out of Canaan and run down to Egypt. But the Lord would have us stick it out in Canaan, at least for a while. That might mean humility on your part. And running the race with endurance. Think of your situation in life right now. Are you running away from what the Lord wants for you? Are you doing that? Sometimes, something else about this guidance the Lord gives, going back to the house of Abram and Sarai is a place of blessing, actually. Think about this for a minute. It's where Abram, God's man, is, isn't it? Isn't it where the place where God's worshipped? Abram worships God in his house. It's where godly influence is, even though Sarai lost it completely for a while there. But if Hagar continues on her way to Egypt, what awaits her there? Familiar environment, but a totally ungodly society, idolatry everywhere. There's idolatry in Canaan, but there's Abram and his family to be the godly influence. One day, Hagar is going to be asked to leave this household of Abram, but this is not that day. So the Lord graciously guides her feet back to Abram's house, even with the difficulties. Go back there. Do your job. This is what I have for you right now. Thirdly, his grace is demonstrated in the prophecy he makes. The prophecy in verses 10 to 12, it's kind of a two-edged sword. Look at verse 10. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. Well, the pregnant Hagar receives good news here out in the wilderness. This is good news. I'm kind of stuck out here in the wilderness and running on the run. I'm going to have many descendants, she hears. This is great news. Hagar's offspring are going to be included in the promise to Abram, it looks like, and have many descendants that can hardly be counted. That's great. Look at verse 11. The angel of the Lord said to her further, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. The name Ishmael means God hears. God hears. I got a guy in my neighborhood named Ishmael. The end of verse 11 literally states the Lord has heard your affliction. Where it says the Lord has given heed to your affliction, it literally says the Lord has heard your affliction. We want that word heard because that's what Ishmael means. God hears, and he says the Lord has heard your affliction. He heard all her painful expressions of grief. Can you imagine her grieving along the way as she leaves the household of Sarai? She's grieving, groaning. The Lord heard all that. You ever wondered, we groan and grieve. The Lord hears all that. So she is to name him Ishmael. I want you to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. And every time Hagar hears the name Ishmael in her life, she's going to think, God hears. God heard me back then in the wilderness. And every time she hears somebody say it, she's going to think, God hears. What a comforting thought to know that God hears us in our affliction. But there's a harsh truth to this prophecy. Look at verse 12. She says, this guy Ishmael, or the angel of the Lord says, Ishmael is going to be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone. Everyone's hand is going to be against him. He's going to live to the east of all his brothers. Ishmael, it appears, will not be winning any awards for personality. He's not going to be student of the year. Look at these 4 statements made about him in detail. First of all, he's going to be a wild donkey of a man. Wow, what a description of somebody to say that about you. Wild donkeys in the desert, then they wanted total independence. Don't mess with the wild donkey. They're not going to cater to you at all. They don't want you around. They don't care about you. They want total independence. And so Ishmael and his descendants are going to live like Bedouins, wandering in the wilderness. It says his hand will be against everyone. He's going to be aggressive. He's going to be an antagonistic, and his people are going to be antagonistic. They're going to be defiant. They're going to exhibit hostile behavior towards people. Thirdly, everyone's hand is going to be against him. What do you think happens to you when you fight against people? They're going to fight back against you. Fourthly, he will live to the east of all his brothers. There's that phrase, the east, again, which is always an ominous term in Genesis. But there's not going to be any peaceful cohabitation between Ishmael and his brothers or his descendants, only hostility. And doesn't history show this to be true? Ishmael's descendants are Arabs. They've always been in conflict with the Jews. It's always been in conflict. There's conflict right now, Kim was telling me about today. There's always conflict over there. So for Hagar, there's bad news mixed with good news. But for the Lord, think about this, for the Lord to show compassion to the mother of this person who's going to be so obstinate and an enemy of God's people, and yet the Lord shows compassion. It's amazing. That's because he's a compassionate God, even to those who, all of us are his enemies. He calls us out of spiritual death to spiritual life. Fourthly, his grace is demonstrated in Hagar's response. Verse 13, Hagar then called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God who sees. For she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Ber-lahai-roi, because it is between Kadesh and Bered. Notice that God is not only a God who hears, but he's a God who sees. Not only does he hear our afflictions, he sees our plight. He sees all this. He knows our need. He's very aware of it. And Hagar is astonished that she has an encounter with the Lord. Verse 14, the well she sits by is given a name, Ber-lahai-roi, meaning the well of the living one who sees me. God sees me here. He heard me, and he sees me, and he talks with me. He cares for me. These ideas, God hears and God sees, equals God cares. God cares for this lowly slave. I don't know the spiritual state of Hagar, but I do know this, the Lord cared for her. The Lord cares for the downcast. 2 Corinthians 1, God comforts those who are downcast, and that ought to be the attitude of all God's people. And then finally, notice Hagar and Abram in verses 15 and 16. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. This is mainly repetitive information, but the fact that Hagar bore Abram a son is emphasized plainly here. And notice who's missing from the last few verses. Sarai, the one who devised the plan, who came up with all this. She's not even mentioned in verses 15 and 16 at all. But what I really want to point out is this. Abraham is 86 at this time. He's getting older. Still no child from Sarai, but the promises of God are still true. What a mess we get ourselves into when we come up with our own solution to the things we see that we're not happy with. We take matters in our own hands. We try to help God fulfill his plan. We create a big mess for everybody. It's such folly. Now, foolish actions are included in the providence of God. Sinful actions are included in the providence of God. I don't understand all these things, but it's not as though the Lord was surprised by her stupidity, or their stupidity, and our stupidity, and our sinfulness. It's not like he's surprised by any of this. Oh, no, he took a wrong turn. Now what do I do? The Lord's not saying that. He works with all these things in his providence. But nevertheless, there are consequences in following our own way versus the Lord's way. There's always consequences. What we learn from this chapter is not to let our desires overcome us to the point we sin against God. I want this thing, whatever it is. I'm going to get it. Whatever it takes, I'm going to get it. We don't want to let that overcome our desire to serve the Lord. The real solution, not the human solution, the real solution is to continue to trust the Lord in spite of our present circumstances. I know they're not easy necessarily. I'm not saying any of this is easy. I'm saying that that's what is best. That's what the Lord would have for us. That's what he would say is best for us. His will is always best. Let me close with Psalm 27:14. Psalm 27:14 says, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord." Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, again, we're grateful for your word. Pray that tonight you'll help us to wait upon you, Lord, that we may be tried this very week, even tomorrow or even tonight. Give us grace to trust you, not to worry about the future, not to worry about circumstances, to trust you with all things, Lord, knowing that you know what is best for us and for your will and purposes in our life, knowing that all things work together for good to those that love God and are called according to his purpose. I pray all this in Christ's name. Amen.